In this video, we're going to examine two different graphs. One of them is going to be the convergence line, and the other one is going to be our per capita production function. And they're both going to help us understand what do we mean by growth, how do we think about growth. So the first one is our convergence line. And what we mean by convergence is we're thinking, suppose we take where countries are today, so they each have different per capita incomes, and we want to see, are we going to look more alike in the future, less alike in the future, or the same in the future? So are poor countries going to become richer and catch up to the US or converge to the US? Or are they going to fall either farther behind, or are they going to remain the same? In essence, we're wondering, will world inequality decrease, increase, or remain the same in the future? And to think about that, my favorite way to think about convergence is think about a track race. So suppose that you're turning into the 100-meter final for the Olympics. So it's the last event, the men's 100-meter. Okay, and imagine that you didn't watch the start, but you turned on the TV right when they're halfway. So they're at the 50-meter mark, or approximately the 50-meter mark. Okay, so here's the start. Here's our finish line. Let me zoom in. So we have our start and our finish line, and the race is over halfway over now. So we know that not everybody's lined up at the same spot like they were at the start. So we have a distribution of where people are in the race. Okay, so it's the men's 100-meter final, so Usain Bolt is going to be in the lead. So here's Usain Bolt. Okay, so there's Usain Bolt running, and then we have a runner behind him. Okay, and then we have another runner right here. Okay, so we have three runners, and they're here, so we have first, second, and third. Okay, so we take a snapshot, or we turn on the TV right at this point. And the question we want to ask is, are these people going to get farther apart at the finish line? Are they going to get closer together? Are they going to stay the same distance apart? Okay, so we want to know who's going to win. Okay, so we have to translate where they are currently or where they were in the past, and we need to look at how fast do they need to run to make it to the finish line at the same point. In essence, we're wondering how fast would each person have to run to make it to the finish so everybody would tie. Okay, if that happens, that's what we think of as convergence. So these people are getting closer and closer together, and they reach the finish point at the same time. So they've converged. Where they're diverse right now, they're going to look more similar in the future. Okay, so we take this distribution right here, and then we need to know how fast are they going to run. And how fast they're running is equivalent to our growth rate. So we're going to take where they are currently, and then we're going to look at how fast do countries need to grow in the future so that they all finish together. Okay, so our graph is going to look like this. So we're going to have GDP per capita today. So this is our snapshot of world economies today. And then on the y-axis, we're going to have the growth rate of GDP per capita. So we'll look at the growth of per capita income today to 50 years from now. Okay, or 50 meters from now. Okay, so this is where we are today. This is where we're going to be in 50 years, or how fast we're going to grow for the next 50 years. And we want to understand is this is our distribution today, so we have dots along here today, and we want to understand how fast do these economies need to grow, or how fast do these runners need to run to make it to the finish line together. Okay, so obviously we need to think of like, well, if this guy wants to tie Usain Bolt by the finish, he's going to have to run the fastest. So this guy who's the furthest behind today is going to have the highest growth rate. This guy is also going to have to run faster than Usain Bolt to make it to the finish line if he's going to catch up to him or converge with him. Okay? But he can't run faster than this guy because if they run the same speed, this guy's going to stay ahead. So this guy needs to run a little bit slower than this guy, but still faster than him. So our middle guy is going to have to run somewhere in here. And Usain Bolt is going to have to run the slowest for everybody to finish at the same time. So our leader is going to have to run the slowest. And what we end up seeing is we see this downward sloping line, and we call this our convergence line. Okay. Or what we mean, if countries are on this line today and they grow this way in the future, such that we're on this line, in 50 years from now, those countries are going to be more similar. Or they're going to be, so we have this distribution of poor countries and rich countries. All these countries will converge and be approximately in the same spot 50 years from now. Okay? So all these poor countries will catch up to the rich countries and will have more similar economies or incomes 50 years from now, if the countries are sitting close to this line. If a country is poor and it's down here, that means it's growing too slow to be able to catch up to these guys. Okay, so it's like this guy not running fast enough. If these two continue to run faster than this guy, he's going to lag behind. So if countries are below this line, that means that they're not going to grow fast enough to catch up in 50 years to everyone else. On the other hand, we can have countries that are above this. So those countries are running too fast. They're going to overtake everyone. So that could be equivalent to Usain Bolt, our second place person, running faster than everyone else. So this guy is going to run faster than him and beat him to the finish. Okay, so if countries are above the convergence line, they're going to be running faster. Are they going to be growing faster than what's needed? So while everyone else may be converging, they're going to be the world leader in 50 years. Okay, and what we really want to know is, what do the distributions of economies look like? Or what does this graph look like? Well, we don't know how fast they're going to grow in the next 50 years. But one thing that we do typically is we look at where were these economies in 1960 as compared to the growth rate from 1960 to present. And that gives us some sense of, since 1960, has the world economy grown more equal, less equal, or remained the same? So let me pull up the graphs. So this first graph is a graph of European countries. So again, down on the x-axis, we have 1960 per capita income. So this is real per capita income in 2005 dollars. Okay, and on the y-axis, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's the average annual growth rate from 1960 to 2007. So 47 years worth of growth. Okay, and this red dotted line is our convergence line. And what we typically see, or what's very common, is most countries sit around this line in Europe. So that means that countries that were poor, relatively poor in 1960, are now much better off and much closer to the rest of the pack presently. So we're looking at Romania and Cyprus, and I believe this is Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Greece. Those countries have grown the fastest, even though they were the poorest in 1960. So those countries have caught up to Britain, Sweden, Belgium, France, Austria, Luxembourg, Norway, so forth. Okay, so what we see is that European economies have converged because they're sitting close to this line. So European countries, if we looked at the distribution today, they would be much closer together and much tighter packed. Okay, whereas they're fairly spread out over the x-axis in 1960. Okay, the natural question comes from, well, this is just Europe, and Europe is showing this convergence behavior. But what about the world economy? So here's what the world economy looks like. And again, we have real GDP per capita in 1960, and this is the growth rate from 1960 to 2000, average annual. Okay? And this black line is going to be our convergence line. And what we tend to see is that there are some countries that sit close to this line. Here's our East Asian tigers. So we have South Korea, we'll have Singapore in there, we're going to have Japan in there, so forth. Okay, so we see some countries that are sitting close to this line. However, we see a lot of scattered countries right in here. And what we tend to see is that if we look at it country by country or region by region, these countries that are not growing nearly fast enough to compete with these guys, so they look less similar today than they did in 1960, tend to be Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so here we have Niger and Central African Republic. So Niger, and we have the Congo in here. Okay, these countries are growing negatively. So that means that they're worse off today than they were in 1960. So if we're thinking about our track race, that means that the guy in third place gave up, turned around, and started running the wrong direction. And that's what we see some countries have done. Other countries have had minimal growth, and they were the poorest in 1960, so that tells us that they're still the poorest countries today. Okay. Furthermore, since these countries over here are growing faster than these countries, they were richer in 1960 and they're growing faster, they've pulled way ahead present day. Okay, the last way that we can break this down is by looking at how open are these economies. So we think about productivity and market efficiency is going to be dominant in growth. So this last graph that we have is looking at open economies versus closed economies. So the red countries are countries that currently have open economies and more free trade. And closed economies are going to be ones that don't really have trade agreements or free trade or very restrictive trade or maybe no trade at all. Okay, and what we see here is our closed economies, our blue ones, tend to be the ones that were the poorest in 1960. Okay, and the chunk of them are down here that are way below our convergence line, which would sit like this. Okay, so if we look at the world economy, the countries that tend to experience the more convergence tend to be the more open economies. Okay, And these closed economies, which tend to be the poorest in 1960, are still the world's poorest and in fact have fallen behind the rest of the world. And most of these are Sub-Saharan Africa in this region right here. Okay, so we want to understand a couple things. First off, why do we see this distribution of income? And secondly, how do countries grow? And that leads us to our growth theory. So our growth theory involves another graph, and it's going to be looking at, it's going to take our determinants of economic growth and put them into a graphical form. Okay, so if you remember, our four determinants of economic growth were labor productivity, human capital, the physical capital stock, and technology. So our graph here is going to be our per capita production function, or we're going to be looking at capital per person. So we'll call it big K over L, or I'm fond to call it small k. Small denotes divided by the labor force. So we're taking into account the physical capital stock and labor. Over here, we want to know income per person, or income per laborer. So we have big Y over big L, which I denote small y because it's divided by L. So we have little k and little y. And we want to understand, if we have a set amount of labor, if we give countries more capital, how does that influence their GDP per capita? Okay? Or we're thinking of taking capital and labor and we're converting it into output for those people. And what we tend to think of is that this production function, or this translation of capital and labor into output, GDP, experiences diminishing returns. And what we mean by that is that, suppose I have no computers for my tax people. So I have, we'll say, 10 accountants, and I have no computers for those accountants. Well, it's really hard to do tax statements, so I probably won't have, I'll have very minimal output, if any. So my output, or my GDP per capita, is going to be very small if I don't have any capital or any computers for my accountants. Okay? Now I still have 10 accountants, and I'm going to add 2 computers to it. So I add 2 computers. Okay? Or we'll say we add 10 computers. So this is 10. Okay, so now I have 10 computers for my 10 laborers, or I'm approximately at 1 capital per worker. Okay, so we'll call this 1. Now each accountant has a computer, and if we're doing tax returns, we can do a lot more tax returns than if we didn't have computers for my people. So here we're going to see a big jump. Now, I have 1 computer per person. What happens if I double that to 2 computers per person? So I take the same distance here, and I go to 2 computers per person. Notice how that first one, this distance right here is distance from 0 to 1. So 0 computers per person to 1 computer per person gave me this much income per person. Okay, now we're going from 1 computer per person to 2 computers per person. So now each of my accountants have 2 computers. And we're looking at how many tax returns can each worker put out. Well, if they're working on one and 1 computer is chugging away, they can start working on another one. So it's going to boost our output. However, it's really unlikely that they can do them both at once. So it's not going to double the output that we have. Right? They're going to have to work on one, and then while that one's chugging away, they can put it aside and start working on another one. So we'll see our output go up, but not double because they can't work on them at the same time, both at the same time. So here, we might see an increase up to there. Okay, now notice that from 0 to 1, this is our increase in income, but from 1 to 2, our increase in income looks like this. So this is from 1 to 2. That's this distance. So it's smaller than what we saw when we added 1 computer per person. Now we're going to go up to 3. So now I give each of my accountants 3 computers per person. Okay. Now again, they'll probably be able to spit out a few more tax returns individually, but it's unlikely that they'll have this same increase or even this same increase because now they just have more computers than they can handle. So we'll still see an increase, but it's going to be less than what we saw before. So now from 2 to 3, we see an increase maybe from here to here. So this is from 2 to 3. So notice how each time I'm adding 1 capital per person, or 1 computer per person in this case, but look at how much my income per person is increasing every time. So it starts out big and gets smaller every individual step. And we can take it to absurd levels. Suppose now I give them 100 computers per person. So my small k is 100. I'd be way out here, but it's unlikely that we're going to have a large increase in income per person. Okay, so if we connect these dots, what we see is a curved line that looks like this. Okay, and this is our per worker production function. So we see small y is a function of small k. Okay, so if you tell me how much capital per worker is in a country, I can tell you how much output they have or what their GDP per capita is going to be. So let me clean this up slightly. Okay, and this graph gives us an idea of why we see rich countries and why we see poor countries. So if we take a currently poor country versus the US tends to have a lot of capital for its people. So every worker has a lot of capital, so this might be the US. So if this is how much capital per worker the US has, I go up to my line and I go over, and this is going to be small y US. So this is US GDP per capita. If we take a developing nation, we'll take maybe Nigeria, and Nigeria doesn't have nearly as many machines as the US, or factories, or computers, or chairs and desks, okay? All that capital. So Nigeria might have a small amount of capital. So here's Nigeria. Okay, and then we go up, and this tells us that Nigeria's income per person is going to be right here. So one way that we can tell is why do we have poorer nations and some nations are rich? One of the explanations for it is that richer nations tend to have more machines or more capital for its workers than poorer nations. So the US has a lot of factories and a lot of machines and a lot of computers. It leads to a higher income per person than a country with less amount of capital for its workers, which is going to lead to a poorer outcome. Okay, so here's our GDP per capita, and we can explain partially why we see this based on how much capital it has for its people, or labor capital per capita. Okay, so as countries grow, they might be able to have more and more capital. So if Nigeria has more and more capital, it's going to move along this way, which means it's going to move up and along this line, and it can catch to the US if it grows faster in capital terms than the US does, then it's going to have faster growth in per capita income as well, or per capita GDP. Okay, so one reason that we see some countries growing faster than others might be that its capital increases at a faster rate. However, remember how we have diminishing returns. The US can have a lot more capital, but we're going to see minimal growth. So what we would expect to see is growth go down to zero as countries become richer and richer. And that's not what we see. The US on average has grown by about 2% per year, 2 to 2.5% per year since 1800. So why has the US still continued to grow, even though, based on this graph, we would expect that as we've added more and more capital for our workers, that effect would diminish. So we start here and we grow out here. Our GDP isn't going to increase, but just a small amount. And that's not what we see. Okay, so the last thing is, well, this graph doesn't really show why countries would continue to grow. So it might show in the short term why countries can catch up or converge, but it doesn't tell us why countries can have sustained economic growth. And the last piece to that puzzle goes back to another determinative of economic growth, which is technology. So this per worker production function looks at technology at a constant rate. We'll say A is our level of technology, A0 in this case. So I'm going to slightly append this. Okay, so let me erase this right here. We'll keep this right here. So we're going to keep Nigeria. Okay. And then lastly, we have to add in technology. So what happens if we have level A0 technology like this? So what happens if Nigeria stayed the same amount of capital per worker, but somehow got better technology? So it adopted assembly lines for production that it currently has. Or if we're thinking agricultural, it has better combines, or it has more safe, so faster combines, or it has more safe fertilizer, or it thinks about crop rotation, which we would think of as technology. Okay, so what happens if we go from technology level A0 to technology level A1? Well, we said with better technology, we would think that we would have more income per person. So here, even though our capital is the same, with better technology, we would expect to see higher income per person. So this would be Y prime for Nigeria. Well, now we're no longer on our per worker production function here. So that tells us with better technology, our production function has shifted up. Or what that looks like is with better technology, this thing has rotated upwards. So this will be Y equals A1 F of K. So now, even though our country hasn't invested in any more capital for its people, with better technology, it's grown richer. Now imagine that we still stay here, but we have technology level A2. Well, with better technology, again, this thing is going to rotate up, and this is going to be Y equals A2 F of K. And here, what we see is here's going to be Y double prime for Nigeria. Now we have technology level A3. Again, we're going to rotate up, and this is going to be y equals A3 f of k. So for Nigeria, even not investing in any more capital or any more machines, what we see is Nigeria has grown. And even if we took the US, Nigeria could surpass the US if the US stayed on the same technology level, while Nigeria instead invested in capital, invested purely in technology, it could grow faster than the US. So since technology doesn't experience diminishing returns, or we think of technology as having constant returns to scale, so every time that we double technology, we can double per capita income, whereas every time we double capital, we didn't double GDP every time. Okay? So with better technology, that's how we think of leading to sustained economic growth. So as technology continues to improve, we would expect to see nations to have continual growth. And the ultimate prescription, what we would say, is not only technology, but increases in investment in the capital. So if our country moved this way as well, it would go from here possibly over to here. So Nigeria's growth path would look something like that overall. So Nigeria, in this case, could grow very rapidly with good technology and investments into its capital infrastructure. Okay, so increases in capital alone without technological investment will lead to short-term economic growth. But it can't be sustained because capital by itself has diminishing returns to scale. However, technology has constant returns. So continual investment into technology can lead to sustained economic growth over a very long time. And the best overall would be technological improvement accompanied by investment into capital. So again, our financial system is looking at these two things. Okay. This also tells us idea about there can be policies that are not conducive to economic growth. So if capital and technology are important factors for economic growth, we can think of as the government as either helping streamline these investments and research and development into capital and technology, or standing in its way. So some of the things that we think of as hinders to growth could be bad governmental policy, such as very high taxes, unstable prices, or if we think of it as maybe no property rights. So if a government didn't allow for property rights, then things can be taken over and it's hard to prove what you have. So if I'm a farmer and I don't have a title for a land, it's very hard to get a loan for fertilizer. So in that case, technology and capital are very hard to come by because I don't have appropriate titles to borrow money. So even though we may have a financial system, if there's nothing there for that financial system to lend to, then we're not going to see improvements into capital or technology. So overall, private property rights and intellectual property rights, such as patents, are going to be extremely important. And a patent says that I am the sole maker of that and I'm recognized as the maker of it. So if we think of it as a drug company investing into its people, which is going to raise labor productivity, it's very expensive to invent a drug. So I might have to invest millions of dollars just to get that drug to the market before it even hits the market. Okay? Once it's hit the market, if there's nothing there to stop it, stop another drug company from basically taking it and copying that idea, right? What's the incentive for me to spend $1 million to bring that drug to the market if another company can just copy it and not have to invest those millions of dollars? So we think of patents as protecting intellectual property or inventions, And overall, that's going to allow pharmaceutical companies to actually invest that money in there because they're protected from having other companies steal that idea from them. And then lastly, we can think about war. So stable economies, so stable governments, and also, so not only politically stable, so you don't have uprisings all the time, but a country that's not continuously involved in war. So if we had a war, it might kill some of our population, and it might blow up some machines. And in that case, if our factories are all destroyed, instead of having capital right here, our capital goes back down to here, and our income per person would drop. That's like anti-growth, or negative growth. So stable economies and stable governments are going to lead to more capital and technology as well. Okay, so governments can either step in the way, or they can help streamline the process to promote capital and technology investments. And if governments help streamline that process, we're going to see economies grow faster than economies where the government is standing in the way, such as by constantly going to war or having no patent system or not protecting private property. So overall, this graph can help us determine why are countries looking different than they were on the convergence line, and why do some countries grow faster than other countries. And it ultimately comes down to some countries may grow faster because they have better technology growth and better capital growth than other countries. And if we look at those countries who are the fastest growing or on that convergence line, they tend to have much more stable governments, be involved in less wars, and also have tighter private property rights and intellectual property rights. Whereas the countries that we saw that didn't grow relatively fast, the government was more in the way in those countries, so we saw less technological growth and less investment in the capital. So of course those countries are going to grow slower.